There's no rush, but while I still exist in this incarnation, I thought I'd be sneaky and tell you about Alpha Draft, a fantasy esports service where you can play all different types of esports game, you can play all different types of contest. Also, Monte Cristo and I play there, so you never know. You might meet ears in a contest, and with the high amount of money to be won, you could win thousands and possibly end up on Cloud9. Not the actual team, I meant that as like a figurative place that people talk about in phraseology. If not, I just pray you don't get your balls slammed in. Now then, so we're on to the video. Skrilla. So Cloud9 has just added 2 players to their roster. They've added Rush as the starting jungler, and they've added BunnyFuFu as the substitute support player, where presumably High will mostly start as the support, and they will rotate BunnyFuFu in, and we'll see how it goes. It's going to be a 6-man roster. Now, where Cloud9 were last split was far from what we ever think of with Cloud9. They were a team that had always made the finals previously. They'd won 2 straight NALCS titles, and then they'd finished second twice. But last split was a disaster. Everyone saw that High's individual game as a mid laner wasn't strong enough for the region. It was having a lot of difficulties internationally, so they brought in Incarnation, this strong solo queue player with all this hype behind him, but he had his issues integrating into the team. Losing High meant the shot calling went to shit to some degree. There was clearly infighting in the team. Like, it seemed like Meteos was unhappy. Balls started to just drop off a cliff completely. So what they did was, Meteos left the team, they brought High in as a jungler. Now High had a lot of difficulties adapting as a jungler, and they ended up finishing in 7th place. They didn't make the playoffs. But the new format for qualifying for Worlds meant that they were in the gauntlet to the qualifier for the 3rd spot, the 3rd seed for Worlds. They made this great gauntlet run where it's not like they were dominant, not like they were like super impressive. They just barely were able to just sneak past every opponent, mainly just by getting to the late game and team fighting their way with decent shot calling around and a few carry performances from Incarnation. And they got to Worlds. But then they were in Pool 3 because they were the 3rd seed. But they got one in theory, a group that wasn't impossible as a 3rd seed. At least there was people that you had a chance to beat. Okay, Fnatic, you maybe would have thought they wouldn't do, but Invictus Gaming, okay, they were themselves a shaky seed coming out of China, and then obviously AHQ is strong, but most people in the West don't know about the strength of the LMS teams. Now, amazingly, Cloud9 came out, they 3-0'd the first week, they had this great fast push comp style. High was suddenly playing decent jungle champions. Before he'd been stuck on a Moo and Shyvana, and he really looked like a mess in the jungle in terms of individual play. His shot calling had been decent, but as his shot calling had improved, so Cloud9 had improved. And they'd gotten to this point of Worlds, and now his shot calling seemed pretty good for a team that was kind of understaffed in terms of talent and the kind of group they were in. So they won the first 3 games, then they lost the next 3 and they lost the tiebreaker. They didn't get to playoffs at Worlds, but all in all, you could see it was a good upward progression trend. Trajectory was nice, but it was also a trajectory that was like pretty much, it felt like they'd maxed out the team completely. They'd gotten the most they could out of the team, which, let's face it, is a position we're used to Cloud9 kind of being in, getting the absolute most out of all their players. But if they were ever going to be a contender for Worlds, if they were going to be a team who could have gone to the semis of Worlds, changes were going to have to happen, and that's what's happened now. So for me, the main storylines of the last split were Balls had huge issues, never really overcame them. He just got onto Darius a few times. High had his difficulties adapting to the jungle, mainly as an individual player. He had a really poor champion pool. Then it got okay, but his shot calling, once he adapted to doing it from the jungle role, got actually pretty good, close to his like mid lane level by the end. And more importantly, Incarnation eventually did come from this player who seemed a bit shook when he was on stage, who seemed to be like initially just trying to be like the new man in and not make too much noise in terms of complaining about lack of jungle pressure, or maybe he was obsessed with jungle pressure, but eventually High coming in, High understanding, like that's what this guy needs to be comfortable. And he really, aside from Sneeze, my only carry player on the team, because I'm not going to carry from jungle. Lemonation's not really that great a support player anymore, and Balls is basically a dead man walking. So at that point in time, it was understood that you needed Incarnation to be good. And so he got the focus he needed, and he was able to improve. He was able to improve his stage performance. His carry potential went through the roof, and now he became like a strong mid laner. I wouldn't say he's really at the level of Bjergsen and Febervin quite yet, but he did have individual games where he was a carry player and was definitely the reason why they won, and even played well in some of the losses, which was quite impressive, I thought. So you take that team, and now you add in these new players. So you add in Rush as the jungler, formerly of Team Impulse, TIP. Now, the first thing to say about Rush, for anyone who doesn't follow this, I understand why people don't follow solo queue in the West, because it's true, solo queue in the West is in general garbage. There's players who've been number 1 who will never be close to the best at their position, even in LCS. Mainly because of people not trying as much, and there's not being the culture around solo queue meaning a lot. But what's interesting is when that whole Balls Diamond 2 worrying trend meme came out and people were trying to shout back, like Western Pros even was saying, yeah, but who cares about solo queue? You know, solo queue rank doesn't mean anything. Yeah, in the West, it doesn't mean anything. The problem is, in Korea, it does mean something. Because in Korea, all the top pros are still trying to keep their level really high in their off time. They're all trying to keep their rank high so they can validate to their bosses, like, I'm still a good player, even if they have bad games. For example, that's how Ambition from CJ into Splays was able to retain his spot for so long, because he was always being a top 5 individual player in solo queue. So it's never like they could say, oh, you're not good enough as a player anymore, even if he had issues in the game. Instead, he could make it like, no, I'll work on these issues. You look at some of the players they have, all the top players are near the top of the solo queue. There's also Chinese players playing all the time. Top pros there trying to show how good they are. LMS pros playing sometimes. So actually it's incredibly competitive. In fact, LMS expert and commentator Clement Chu even said in the Korean solo queue rank really is like a good determiner of how good you are. Like players who aren't that good are just never going to have a shot at Challenger in Korea. It will never happen for them. It's so competitive. So the reason I'm setting this context up is Rush is probably the best player we've ever seen in NALCS in terms of his level in solo queue as of like the time he's played in NALCS, because he's Korean, so he's gone back to Korea a number of times. So before he joined TIP, then after he joined TIP, then during different points in time, every time he goes back to Korea, he's getting rank 1 on solo queue in Korea. He's the best player on solo queue in Korea to some degree. He's having games where if you watch his stream games, he's like hard carrying, brutalizing the other team, wrecking the other jungler and getting ganks all off the map when he's playing against Faker, Deft, these godlike players from Korea. So this is a phenomenally talented player, especially and most interestingly as a hard carry jungler style player, but one who does it by getting ganks off all the time. He's not just that he gets key ganks off and he just farms a lot. He gets it by doing mad, like if he's the guy where if he gets a gank, he's going to turn that into another gank, and then he's going to take his 2 kills, he's going to go buy an item, he's going to use that to do a damage, and he's going to go and fuck someone else up and just snowball the whole game. That's what's great about him. He's a carry jungler, but he's a snowball carry jungler, which is potentially very exciting for this lineup they've got in Cloud9 now. Now, you look at him as a player, I think that actually TIP, for me, when I looked at their team, was basically all about Impact and Rush. Impact was super stable, Rush, and could play carry champions. Rush was this carry jungler. He was clearly the star. The problem with TIP for me was when Zhao Weizhao, who was really kind of like, to me, he was best left as like a wildcard pawn type player, who was really up and down depending on his champion, but could carry the game when he had the right champion. The problem is when Zhao Weizhao got banned for the elo boosting, that put them in a situation where they had this inexperienced guy with a very limited champion pool, basically Azir, and you had to put him, if not on Azir, on just super supportive shit like Lulu. And so because you were putting him on that, who knows why, they then thought to themselves, right, well, now the carry has to be the AD carry, Apollo, who was like a sort of a clean-up AD carry. And so instead, they made Impact just be this stable top laner who was playing supportive champions himself, and they put all the damage onto like the Cogmore of the AD carry, whereas Impact is probably suited to be a carry player in that meta. And then with Rush, you can snowball Impact, but they chose not to go that route, probably because they were worried about how Gate would do in the mid lane. So I think Rush, as good as he looked, and he did look phenomenal, even had great games in the playoffs, he could have been even better. Like, I actually thought if they'd had Zhao Weizhao, that would have been a really interesting series between TIP and CLG, and it wouldn't have just been as clear-cut as it was, and they could have contended potentially to make the final. And instead, if they had it done, it would have been on his back. So to me, he was like the MVP level candidate. Certainly, he was a phenomenal player. Now, what's interesting is when he comes into Cloud9, one of the really good things is, first of all, that he's now going to be able to help out Incarnation, not least because since they've got Balls as their top lane and Balls hasn't showed any signs of life for about a year and a half, you're looking at the team and you're going, right, it's got to be about Incarnation. He's the main carry player on the team, along with Sneaky, but the difference is super carry mid laner can obviously do a lot, whereas at the moment, even a really good AD carry, at least in the previous meta, had to play around the team to some degree. If you can get Incarnation rolling, you can have a really good chance to win the game. And so with a snowball carry type jungler who loves to get sick ganks off, this is ideal for Incarnation, because it means, first of all, he can get snowballed himself. Secondly, he's going to, in theory, have constant pressure. So that whole worry he used to have, like, that's one of the things I talked to him about when I first went there to do those interviews with Cloud9. And what he was so concerned about was he was the kind of player where maybe because he was new to the stage environment, he felt like he needed like full vision control all around the mid, and that he needed to know that he could play aggressive in lane and harass the guy, because because he needed to know the jungler couldn't be in that brush there. He was so worried that if he went forwards and he harassed and tried to carry his lane, try to get the CS advantage, that he would just get repeatedly ganked and that it would throw the game in that sense. And the last thing he wanted to do was be the guy feeding in mid lane, because he's a brand new player. All the rest have played in a team for many years, and he's supposed to come and be the saviour. So you can see the pressures that were on him, and that was clearly in his mind. It was clearly fucking with him. But that's what was great. I remember that interview where Hai said something along the lines of that he told Incarnation, like, wasn't it some line along the lines of like, if you carry me, then I'll carry you to Worlds, or some line along those lines. It's all like, it was like, you're going to be the carry player, and if you can just carry the game, I'll do the rest. I'll get the team in a position where we can actually go to Worlds. And if that mentality, I feel like, helped free Incarnation up a bit. So with Rush, it's less an issue with that. It's more like you have this super duper jungler who wants to go, wants to make plays. Therefore, just get ready, just pack up, let's go. And not only that, now the other mid lane is going to be worried about where Rush is all the time. So in theory, those worries should be gone, and Incarnation should be freed to be as good as he was at Worlds and in the Gauntlet run. You also look at the fact that one of your big concerns is during the games where you don't play Hai as the support player, you don't have that shot calling, and instead you have BunnyFuFu, who is a shot caller but not on the same level as Hai, especially not holistically in terms of understanding of the whole map and how to play the meta. Since you're not going to have that shot calling some of the time, you'd hope by having this super strong carry jungler and now having this really strong mid laner that you can snowball games more to the point where you don't have to do those amazing comebacks we think of with the old Cloud9, which is where a lot of the great shot calling came in, or having to be in a tense mid game where you then at one great call or maybe on an objective decides how you win the game. So I think Rush can potentially be a very, very good addition here. What's interesting as well is he made the comment in his introduction interview that Cloud9's used to having carry type junglers, but what's funny is I wonder if it's just like him himself translating wrong what he meant to say. But he said that in the sense that Meteos and Hai were farm heavy junglers. Now what's funny is, even though he's a carry jungler, Rush, I don't think of him as a farm heavy carry jungler. To me, he's the carry jungler who gets his kills and his gold from kills, from making action on the map, and that's how he dominates the game and snowballs it. So I wonder if he just thinks of farm jungler as carry jungler, he thinks they're synonymous, because to me he's not going to be so farm heavy, he's just going to be beasting all over the map. Like that's how he's his best, and he has the potential to be the best jungler in NA this split. That's absolutely interesting in itself, especially because now we're going to get to see him go against Svenskeren. That'll be very interesting right there, because those were, to me, were the two beast carry junglers of their regions last split. So then you look at the fact that they've brought in BunnyFuFu. Now when I first heard the rumours they're adding BunnyFuFu, obviously the initial assumption was that they're adding him as the permanent player, and at the time it sounded like initially, I mean they even said this in their post about it, that it was going to depend who they could get at jungler support, and maybe they'd put like Hai as a jungler if they couldn't get a good jungler, and they'd just put someone else as support. So I thought maybe that means they're just going to have Hai as the jungler and have the shot calling there. The main issue with BunnyFuFu is he's a good player in regular splits. At times he's been a very good player, he's been one of the best at his position, but you look at his playoff runs and they're still a bit shaky. They're not shaky as in bad, he just plays okay, but he doesn't play up to the level that we've seen when he's in regular split. And he is one of those players where it still has to be said, even though he improved a lot, and obviously he's one of the guys who was one of the first using Shen support, was getting a lot of effectiveness out of that initially. I think he overused it towards the end. One of the issues is, yeah, he's amazing at Thresh, but he's also a player where if you just ban his Thresh, it really does limit him in terms of the pass splits, in terms of how much he has the potential to make carry type incredible plays himself in the game. So that's something that might be freed up in Cloud9 if he plays, because they've got lots of other good players, but also might still be a concern that he has to improve in that sense. Likewise, his shot calling kind of went with his individual play. In the regular split, it seemed decent. At times it was good, but it hasn't really ascended like a top tier level yet. And at times it was clearly off as well. And you look at the end of the split when they were losing, there were clearly some key mistakes being made here. It is hard, I have to admit, to judge Gravity, because of the fact that, to me, Gravity was so influenced by what I consider kind of bullshit picks by Keen, as in Keen was the ultimate best of one player, where over a series he was never going to be a beast, he was never going to dominate the whole series, but in best of ones he could catch you off with these weird picks, especially new picks that weren't meta picks in any sense, and some of them wouldn't even become meta picks. that might only work once or twice, but you would be able to get him to work. And then his abusive way of playing, once he did get those kills on those champions, meant that these were almost like one-off games that weren't going to be able to be replicated later anyway. So it wasn't a good style. Therefore, to me, it was hard to judge how some of the other players were playing. And I think as a result, people like Hauntzer looked worse when they were in the playoffs because Keen just went completely to shit, and also they were never on the right side of the map. If you remember, there was that scenario where they had the choice to have an extra game on the side of the map that they had all previously got loads of their wins on, and they actually chose not to, bizarrely, in the playoffs. I mean, that coach should be getting fucking fired, but oh well. So the thing about BunnyFuFu is the fact that he's a sub rather than starter is what's so interesting. Because I would hope, even though in the video they presented like, listen, we can learn things off each other, like maybe BunnyFuFu can help High learn some things. Okay, true. But to me, the main thing to have BunnyFuFu there for is if High has injury problems, but secondly, to hopefully train some of his shot calling faculties. Now, I don't think shot calling is something that is just as simple as other areas of the game that you can just sit down and train it and learn it. I do think everyone can improve a bit. So my main thing with that is I would hope that BunnyFuFu is going to be watching and listening to all these games and just trying to figure out how does High, within High's style of shot calling, how does he figure out what he's going to do in the team? When's the right place in a game or a moment to make this sort of a comment? Also, what's High doing in terms of what he says? What's behind that? Like, is he saying this right now because tactically it's the best thing to do, or is he saying this right now to allay the fears of someone like Incarnation who's concerned that like, oh, they might come and gank me mid in a second? Or is he telling Balls like, you can play safe for a little bit? Is that because he just sees the map that way? Is that because it's for the comfort of the player? The way he sees the game, and then being able to deconstruct that and have BunnyFuFu reassemble it in terms of how he sees the game, not as a replica, but as like taking what works and trying to see what would work for him. That to me is potentially the most interesting part of this move, because in the future they clearly can't have High forever. We also definitely don't know that High will be a good support player, so they're going to need to work. To me, BunnyFuFu has to be like a work in progress that is going towards the goal of eventually him becoming the starter. Now, if he becomes the starter, obviously the issue there is they won't have the brilliant shot calling that they got from High. They'll have to lose that. But again, as we said when they originally lost High, the aim is to have a good enough team elsewhere that you have good enough shot calling, like the majority of the other teams do. They don't have super god tier shot callers in general, aside from Yellowstar and Fnatic. But what you want to have is just good enough shot calling that having a fantastic team can execute that like effective enough shot calling to be able to win games. And that's what you want to go for eventually with BunnyFuFu, because High can't play forever, quite clearly. There's also the fact that when they do have High in the game, one of the areas I see as being good is, first of all, Lemonation was having individual problems for me like over a year ago. Like, the difference was he had the smarts to stay in the game, but his individual game hasn't been that good since probably like season 3 if we're being realistic. But he always played so well with Sneaky, he knew what Sneaky needed. I would hope that High can do that in terms of, because he's a player who seems very good at understanding what his teammates need. He can be able to accommodate Sneaky so that Sneaky has success individually in the lane. And here's where I think it's interesting. Because I see Balls as a liability, for me, the carries have to be Incarnation and Sneaky. So I would hope that High being in Sneaky's lane means then High's shot calling, once he adapts to doing it from support, means he can actually include Sneaky more primarily within what the team concept's going to be. Because he can then know when to transition what they're doing in bot lane into overall map pressure, or how to take an objective, or how to win a particular team fight. And since Sneaky's going to be one of your main damage output sources, this is ideal that you kind of got somebody who's directly connected to him and knows exactly where he's at to then be able to position that missile towards the enemy, as it were, and direct it in that sense. Now, in terms of the expectations for Cloud9 for this split, I look at this lineup and I say, with all the lineups I've seen so far, I think this should be a top 3 team. I think they should be in contention for the top spot. At the moment, it's hard to put them ahead of the TSM and the NRG lineups, because on paper those look so exciting, but obviously we don't know how those lineups will work in reality. Now, we don't either with this one, and there are still a few question marks. Like, you have to look at it and say that when they have High in the game, they're going to have better shot calling, but they'll have a slightly weaker lineup in terms of the individual skill, and they might have some issues initially with High. Who knows, maybe for the whole split, but initially at least as a support player only. Then you look when they have BunnyFuFu in, they'll have a stronger individual lineup, but the shot calling will be a little bit more compromised. And for the whole split, the biggest question mark for me is just Balls. Like, what's going to happen with this guy? Like, in the past, aside from the first split he played, It's never been the case that you could just put balls on like normal meta champs and just go, don't worry about him, he'll just play safe, doesn't need much jungle pressure, and we'll just do fine in the game. That's never really been the way. Usually it was more like he played his specific champions, and then certain games he would have the chance and he would carry, and then in the spring split of 2014 he was actually one of the main carry stars of the team. He's had his issues since then. He didn't look good at Worlds. Even in the couple of games they won, it was hard to look at him and go, right, he's back, he's figured out the meta, he's going to be really strong now. It looked like a lot of other factors were part of what was allowing them to do so well. So that's still a big concern for me. Admittedly, the rest of the team does look like it's improving. It's in a good place. So at the moment, I'd pencil them in for a third or fourth level team, and we'll see how it goes during the split. Thanks to Alpha Draft.